Have you ever noticed that the people who hurt us the most are the ones we let closest to our hearts? There's a moment in everyone's life when the pain of betrayal becomes so unbearable that we make a silent promise to ourselves, never again. Never again will I be vulnerable. Never again will I trust so freely. Never again will I let anyone close enough to wound me this deeply. But what if I told you that this protective wall you've built isn't shielding you from pain, but from life itself? What if the very thing you think is keeping you safe is actually your greatest prison? Carl Jung, one of history's most profound psychologists, once wrote something that stopped me in my tracks. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again. At first glance, these words sound like a comforting promise of safety, but Jung wasn't offering comfort. He was issuing a warning. I remember sitting across from my therapist on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I just recounted the story of yet another relationship that had exploded in my face. "I'm done," I told her confidently. "I'm never letting anyone get that close again." She looked at me with eyes that held no judgment, only recognition, and said, "Ah, so you've chosen numbness over pain. That's a terrible bargain we're rarely conscious of making. In our desperate attempt to avoid suffering, we unknowingly sacrifice our capacity for joy." The journey, the shadow of protection. Think about a child who falls off a bicycle and scrapes their knee. The pain is sharp, immediate, overwhelming. Some parents might say, "That's it, no more bike riding." Others might clean the wound, offer comfort, and then gently guide them back onto the seat. "Try again," they'll say. "I'm right here." We are simultaneously that child and that parent to ourselves. When we experience emotional wounds, rejection, betrayal, loss, we face the same fundamental choice: protect at all costs or heal and try again. Jung discovered that many of his patients had unconsciously chosen protection. They'd built psychological fortresses so impenetrable that indeed nothing and nobody could hurt them anymore. But these same walls prevented love, connection, and growth from reaching them as well. They had achieved safety, but at what cost? I think of James, a brilliant architect I once knew. After his fiancée left him just weeks before their wedding, he threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. His designs won awards. His career soared. But at night, he would sit alone in his immaculate apartment, surrounded by beautiful things that couldn't love him back. 10 years passed this way. When I asked if he was happy, he replied with perfect honesty, "I don't feel anything enough to be unhappy. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again when you've numbed yourself to everything that makes us human." The paradox of vulnerability. There's a fascinating contradiction at the heart of human connection. The things that make us most vulnerable to pain are precisely the same things that allow us to experience profound joy and meaning. Consider what happens when you truly open yourself to someone. You share your deepest fears, your awkward truths, the parts of yourself you normally keep hidden. In doing so, you hand them a map to all your tender places, the exact locations where a wound would hurt the most. Yet without this vulnerability, what do we have? Superficial connections, small talk, relationships that never transcend the surface. As researcher Brené Brown discovered, vulnerability isn't a weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. I'm reminded of Elena, a woman who survived the unimaginable, losing her husband and young daughter in an accident. For years afterward, she moved through life like a ghost. "I can't go through that again," she told me. "I can't love like that again." But life has a way of challenging our most firmly held convictions. When her sister fell ill and needed help raising her son, Elena reluctantly stepped in. At first, she was mechanical in her care, feeding, bathing, helping with homework, all without emotional investment. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she insisted. Then one night, the boy had a nightmare. Half asleep, he reached for her and whispered, "I'm scared." Something broke open in Elena. She held him until his breathing steadied, and as she did, she felt her own heart beating again, painfully, wonderfully alive. Elena later told me, "I realized I had two choices: never love again and be safe, or love again and be fully human, with all the risk that entails. I chose to be human." The wisdom of wounds. What if our wounds aren't merely painful experiences to avoid, but essential teachers we need to encounter? Jung believed that our psychological injuries contain wisdom we can access nowhere else. Each heartbreak, each betrayal, each disappointment carries a specific lesson about ourselves and the world, if we're brave enough to examine it, rather than bury it beneath layers of protection. There was a Zen master who was asked by his student, "How can I avoid pain?" The master replied, "Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional." This distinction is crucial. Pain is the immediate response to an injury, physical or emotional. Suffering is what happens when we resist the pain, when we build our lives around avoiding it, when we let fear of future hurts dictate our choices. I think of Marco, a young musician whose first album was savagely criticized. He stopped creating for nearly 3 years, paralyzed by fear of further rejection. When he finally returned to music, something had changed. His new songs had a depth and authenticity his earlier work lacked. "I realized the critics couldn't actually hurt me unless I gave them that power," he explained. "Their opinions were just opinions. Once I understood that, I was free to create again, not for their approval, but for the joy of expression." What Marco discovered was that by facing the source of his pain directly, by examining it with curiosity rather than fear, he could extract its lesson and leave the suffering behind. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming our full, integrated selves. This journey doesn't avoid darkness. It moves directly through it. Each wound, when fully processed, becomes a source of strength rather than weakness. The anatomy of invulnerability. Let's look more closely at what happens when we choose Jung's warning path, when we arrange our lives so that nothing and nobody will ever hurt us again. The mechanisms are subtle at first. We might become slightly more guarded in conversations, hesitating before sharing personal details. We might begin to pre-reject others before they can reject us. We might redirect conversations away from emotional territory, keeping things light, uncontroversial, safe. Over time, these small guardedness grow. We develop what psychologists call emotional armor, protective layers that prevent others from getting too close. This armor takes many forms: perfectionism, cynicism, busyness, emotional unavailability, or constant joking that deflects intimacy. I once met a woman named Sarah who had perfected the art of invulnerability. After a childhood with emotionally abusive parents and a devastating divorce in her 20s, she had systematically eliminated all possibility of being hurt again. Her strategy was flawless. She kept all relationships at a careful distance, never shared her authentic feelings, and maintained absolute financial and emotional independence. "I don't need anyone," she told me with unmistakable pride. "I've built a life where I can't be hurt." What struck me about Sarah wasn't her confidence, but the emptiness that surrounded it. Her life was meticulously controlled, perfectly ordered, and utterly devoid of the messy human connections that give life its richness. She had achieved invulnerability, but at the cost of her humanity. Jung would recognize this pattern immediately. He observed that the more we try to be invulnerable, the more we cut ourselves off from our own souls. We become what he called persona identified, so focused on maintaining our protective outer image that we lose touch with our authentic inner life. The irony is heartbreaking. In trying to protect ourselves from pain, we inflict a deeper wound: separation from our true nature and from meaningful connection with others. Here's the profound truth that Jung understood: complete invulnerability is indistinguishable from death. Think about it. What is death but the ultimate state of never being hurt again? The only way to be genuinely invulnerable is to be beyond feeling altogether. Anything short of that, any life worth living, requires openness to both pain and joy. The most protected heart is not the strongest. It's the most atrophied. I was hiking in the mountains once, far from any trail, when I came across something extraordinary: a tree growing out of solid rock. Somehow this pine had sent roots into the tiniest cracks, finding enough soil and water not just to survive, but to thrive. Its trunk was twisted from years of battling harsh winds, its bark scarred from ice and sun, yet it stood, more magnificent precisely because of the adversity it had faced. That tree couldn't have achieved its stunning resilience in a greenhouse. It needed the very challenges that threatened to destroy it. We are not so different. Our capacity for resilience, genuine, soul-deep resilience, isn't built by avoiding pain. It's forged directly through it. Each wound we fully face and integrate becomes not a weakness, but a source of unique strength and wisdom. Perhaps then, the question isn't how to arrange our lives so nothing and nobody will ever hurt us again. Perhaps the better questions are these. How might we remain open even in a world where pain is inevitable? What if we approached our wounds not as failures of protection, but as invitations to deeper understanding? What would change if we valued resilience over invulnerability, the ability to recover rather than the attempt to avoid pain altogether? The answers to these questions aren't theoretical. They manifest in the small choices we make every day. In the moment when you're tempted to hide a mistake at work, but choose honest vulnerability instead. In the decision to reach out to someone you miss, even though they might reject your overture. In the courage to pursue a passion that exposes you to criticism. In Jung's framework, these aren't just practical choices, they're spiritual ones. They reflect our fundamental orientation toward life itself. Do we primarily seek safety, or do we seek fullness of experience? I think of David, a former client who spent decades hiding his homosexuality from his conservative family and community. Every conversation was carefully edited, every relationship compartmentalized, every emotional response monitored for anything that might expose his secret. I became so good at hiding, he told me, that I think I disappeared, even from myself. The day he finally came out to his parents was the most terrifying of his life. The conversation was difficult, painful, imperfect. His father didn't speak to him for months afterward. Yet when David described the moment to me, he used a phrase I'll never forget. It was like I had been breathing through a straw my whole life, and suddenly I could use my full lungs. This is what can happen when we choose vulnerability over protection. We access parts of ourselves that have been constrained, allowing life to flow more fully through us. The pain doesn't disappear. In fact, it might temporarily intensify. But something else enters alongside it. A sense of authenticity, of alignment with our deeper nature. Consider the Japanese art of Kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold. The philosophy behind this practice is that breakage and repair are part of the history of an object, not something to disguise. The gold-filled cracks don't diminish the pottery's value. They enhance it, making each piece uniquely beautiful. What if we treated our emotional wounds the same way? Not as flaws to hide, but as the very places where the light enters us, where wisdom takes root, where our unique capacity for empathy and understanding is born? Jung believed that our psychological wounds, when consciously engaged rather than defended against, become doorways to what he called the self, the integrated wholeness at the core of our being. He wrote that, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and this becoming inevitably involves encounters with pain." There's a paradoxical truth here. The more we arrange our lives to avoid hurt, the smaller our lives become. Every protection exacts a cost and possibility. Every defensive strategy limits our range of motion. Every wall that keeps pain out also keeps life out. What would it mean to practice emotional kintsugi in your own life? To honor your wounds without being defined by them? To allow your broken places to be part of your beauty rather than sources of shame? It might mean practicing what psychologists call radical acceptance. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again, Carl Jung.